Hello, everyone. My name is Kerry Davis. I'm the Director of the Centre for Deliberation at NatSen.
And I'm Suzanne Hall, Director of Engagement at the Policy Institute at King's College London. And thank you so much for all of you for joining us today for our ongoing informal seminar series, where we're exploring a range of different aspects to do with the theory and practice of deliberation. I think just by way of introduction, through these seminars, we're aiming to provide an informal, non-judgmental and conversational space for practitioners, for theorists, for academics, policymakers, anyone and everyone who are interested in these approaches and ways of working to come together and listen to different experts in their field talk about their perspectives and experiences of deliberation, as well as their reflection on what works and what could be better.
So the conversations that we're having in these seminars are meant to be inclusive. We're talking about deliberation in the broadest sense. So not just the role that citizens' assemblies can play, although that of course is part of it, but how we can use the full range of deliberative approaches, some of which we'll discuss today, to engage meaningfully with the public and policymakers on some of the most pressing social policy issues of our time, like trust in political institutions and political participation. So we'll introduce today properly in a moment, but just a reminder that we would love to hear from you about what you'd like these seminars to cover. We've covered issues around deliberating for future scenarios, how to have impact, how deliberation can help us do democracy differently, to name a few. But there'll be many more issues that you're dealing with or interested in and would like to know more about. So please do tell us what they are. You can put something in the chat, you can email us, or you can tweet us.
Whatever the topic, though, these conversations aren't intended to be a how-to guide. We're not going to tell you what it is that you need to do. Rather, we hope that what you'll hear today and in future seminars will encourage you to reflect on your own practice and inspire you to try out new approaches and do something differently. We also hope that they'll help you develop a language to talk to clients, funders, commissioners about the value of these approaches as well. More than anything, though, we really hope to forge a community of practice. We're all here today because we're intrigued by or we're grappling with the potential and possibility that these approaches can bring. And we can better realise all of those by working together and sharing what we found along the way. Now, today our seminar is entitled Engaging Citizens on Economic Policy, What Role Can Deliberative Methods Play? With some excellent speakers here, we wanted to put a spotlight on the ways in which deliberation is being used in an area where we don't have a lot of existing examples. You might be familiar with things like participatory budgeting, which has a really rich history in the Latin American context, but certainly fiscal policy in a Western European sense has not. So to help close that gap, we're going to explore a couple of different projects that show us a few different possibilities.
So to talk through these issues today, we're delighted to be joined by our brilliant panel. We've got Nicholas Gruen, who's CEO of Lateral Economics and was formerly the chair of the Australian Centre for Social Innovation and an economist. We were due to have Rima Patel, who's head of deliberative engagement at Ipsos, but unfortunately she's not well today, so she can't join us. But we also have Dr. Chris Holmes of King's College London, and he's going to share his thoughts and also the recent work that he's done with Rima on the Citizens Economic Council. And we also have Isabel Lee, who's interim head of public and stakeholder engagement at the Bank of England, who can tell us a bit more about their Citizens Forum. So without any further hesitation on our part, I'm going to go over to Nicholas and ask him to begin.
Okay, I'm on, aren't I? My mic is not muted, nothing's wrong. So I wanted to speak briefly about the recent report that Rima and Chris were instrumental in producing of the Citizens Economic Council. That was a deliberative process which seems to have been can I say, predictably successful. These things, if they're done properly, are usually very constructive. The broad what happened certainly confirmed my understanding of what typically happens here, and maybe in order to dramatize this, I can present you with the contrast between our current system, which is a highly theatrical system, which has become more and more adversarial, in which essentially we have kind of escalating misrepresentation of the different sides of the debate. And in that environment, people become more and more jealous of their own interests because they see people with whom they disagree people who they sometimes think are not really true citizens. They're not true Britons, true Americans, true Australians, and so on. And in that context, they're very keen to make sure that their interests are well expressed and that they prevail. If you think about the theatricality of a citizens' council, which is a bunch of everyday people getting together and discussing issues, then the very theatre of it is, well, here we all are, and these are problems that we have to solve together. And in that environment, two things typically happen. With regard to the human environment, there is an instinct for inclusion, and that is reflected in the Citizens Economic Council, particularly in the desire to make sure that those who are most disadvantaged are given the greatest consideration in how to respond to some issue, which in this case was the cost of living situation. And this is also true for the non-human environment. So to give you a nice little stat, going into a citizen jury in Texas, which was actually run when Governor George W. Bush was the governor. So 1999, I think, was when it was run. And people were asked going in, would they be prepared to pay a small amount more for renewable energy? And going in, 54% of people said yes. And coming out, 82% of people said yes. And that type of thing is also quite commonly replicated. So the other thing that I think that I would like to highlight is the buzz that people get by doing this. I like to think of us human beings as the primate, the hairless primate, the highly vulnerable primate that survived on the African savannah by solving problems in groups, small groups. And we discover that we're made for this. We're incredibly good at it, and it gives us a huge buzz, and we can see all the footprints of that in this report. I want to now leave you with two questions hanging in the air, to sort of let them hang in the air. Andy Haldane, who's been closely involved in this process in various guises, spoke about the twin deficit in economics, and he talked about it as a deficit of public understanding and a deficit of public trust. And I want to suggest to you that there are two other deficits, and in some ways they're more important, or they're certainly kind of stickier, and they're very rarely talked about. The first is, I would call it the deficit of candor. And what I mean by that is that the model in our heads when we talk about this is two methods of deliberation, the current one we have and more of a more deliberative activity of the kind we've talked about. And there's this idea that if we give people better understanding, they'll make better decisions. Well, yes, but our current system of election-based decision-making is built on a massive candor deficit, which is that if you are going to cut expenditure or raise taxes, then your opponents will, if you're in government, you end up having to sell that sort of stuff. And if you're in opposition, you spend all your time saying that the government's lying to you. These are terrible for hardworking Britons, and so on. So in fact, what's happening is that the truth is being picked apart, and various people inhabit these discourses on a highly opportunistic basis. And I would argue that's what people hate, that's what they viscerally understand, that they are watching weapons grade inauthenticity, and it's essentially uninhabitable. The discourse is uninhabitable, and journalists are part of it, and so on. I'll finish by saying that there's another deficit, and that deficit is an accountability deficit. And what's happening at the moment is that there are quite a few, there's quite a bit of interest in deliberative democracy, quite a bit of interest in these kinds of activities where we select people, or everyday people, and we let them deliberate, give them more information, and so on. And then they make recommendations. And what happens then? Well, then it goes to the real decision makers, who are, guess who? The elected representatives. And we're back with the system that we started. And we are, in a sense, rehearsing their primacy over this alternative. And that creates, essentially what happens is, if we can solve a problem for them, that's good, and they'll take the solved problem and they'll sell it. And if we can't, then they've just got an issues management issue. They'll manage the issue, and on we'll go. Now, it's an accountability deficit, because think of Macron's citizen assembly on greenhouse, on climate change. The assembly produced lots of recommendations, and then, and I'm now going to present this in a fairly sympathetic way to Macron, to the office holders. The job of office holders is, he wanted, I think, to implement as much as he could. And as Jean-Claude Juncker once said, we all know what the right thing to do is, we just don't know how to do it and then get re-elected. And that was Macron's problem. And so we have this problem that, in a sense, the jury's not accountable because it's not going to get voted out, and then the government is, and then we go back into the same old system. So I'll leave it there, and we'll be very interested in how the discussion develops.
Yeah, thank you, Nicholas. So definitely some interesting points to reflect on there. I'm going to go to you next, Chris, to talk a little bit about the work that Nicholas began with.
Yes, thank you very much for having me along to this. I come from a political economy tradition, so it's really great to be able to reach out and speak to, a lot of people who've been working in this deliberative space a lot longer than me. And thank you, Nicholas, for your kind words. And I think, I pretty much agree with everything you said, and I think that is reflected in the work that we did. I won't go over everything to do with the project. The report's out, and so people are welcome to read it. I'll just say a few key details. It was, a sortition selected process with citizens from across the UK. We ended up with a total of 39. The question that we asked was, how should government respond to the cost of living crisis via fiscal policy specifically? And I think it was initially driven for me by the desire to understand what citizens think if they're given good quality information and time to discuss, in contrast to focus group data that we often see used in the economic policy space currently. And I suppose our USP in our project was the concept of the hard trade-off. And we tried to make sure that at all stages, we talked about the risks and the uncertainties and the losers from policy change. And so we used fiscal policy modelling in order to be able to give a reasonably accurate static representation of what those losses might look like in the UK household space. So that was one of the big selling points, I think, of what we did and what made it unique. And we came out with a series of recommendations. As Nicholas highlighted, vulnerability in crisis conditions was a key theme which the participants brought to the table, and we gave them lots of other potential routes to take, but that they just kept on coming back to that conception of vulnerability. The second really interesting thing was their emphasis on the long term. So we did make space for a discussion of long-term investment. That was one of our scenarios we presented to them. But right from the beginning, the citizens wanted to talk about the long term and how we're thinking long term beyond parliamentary electoral cycle and so on. What are we doing for the next generation? It was just instinctive to them to discuss those things. And the other thing to say, I think, is just how surprising the participants found some basic economic statistical data like about how few households in the UK earn enough to pay income tax, for example. That was really surprising. And then they were surprised to hear how significant VAT was, value-added taxation, as a component of people's personal level of taxation. So these things, quite simple facts and issues that any kind of public policy economist would be aware of, were news, and it really changed the way that they thought about this. So economic literacy is a big part of this, and I think what we're doing is only one part of a broader discussion about how we improve economic literacy and what that might mean for policymaking. So, in terms of the benefits or what this can offer, I think it's about building consensus, right? And getting citizens and getting public debate to a situation where it's not just about self-interest. And that was really evident in the feedback we got. The participants were so happy to be speaking to people in other demographics, and were surprised at how often they agreed with one another, and how easy they found to get over their differences, if you like. And that was on quite specific questions of economic policy, but also about what fairness was in economic policy, and those slightly more nebulous ethical questions as well. And I think that is really important now, because it gets us away from that sense of zero-sum conflict between individuals and between groups in society. So Nicholas has already talked about polarization and the kind of culture wars climate. There's a lot of political capital in appealing to extremes and creating dividing lines, and deliberation gets beyond that. But also, in an economic sense, there is a bit of a sense in which things are a bit more zero sum at the moment. In some ways, our political economic system is predicated on having enough growth to diffuse conflict. So if everyone feels like their incomes are rising and that they're progressing in life, they've got job opportunities and so on, then there's that less of a sense of that zero-sum conflict. But of course, we've been in a very low growth environment in the UK and across many countries over the past 10 or 15 years. So when the chips are down and you do have this more sense of distributional conflict, then I think deliberation offers us a way to get beyond that. And I think that is something that did work in our project. They were very happy, the participants, to reflect on their self-interest and what it would mean for them, but to move beyond that and then think in a kind of society-wide way. We didn't have to push the participants to do that. And then on top of that, obviously, we've got climate change as well. And as far as I can see, every conceivable future involves a reduction of consumption, right? So then the question of distribution, who has to reduce consumption most and where, it's going to become increasingly important. So we have to find ways that avoid us sinking into zero-sum conflict. And I don't think deliberation has all the answers, but I think it's certainly a part of the mix. So yeah, we tried to embody that in what we did by presenting hard trade-offs, giving strict budget lines, talking about the risks and the opportunities of different policy choices. And yeah, I hope that this kind of approach or similar approaches will continue to be a part of the policy landscape. So I'll stop there, but I've got plenty more to say as we come on to questions.
Excellent, Chris. Thank you. And yeah, you find allies on that point. I think we'd all like to see how this could work a bit better. Isabel, finally, over to you.
Thanks very much, Katie. And thank you very much. I'm very new to deliberative theory, so it's really fascinating to learn more about it all and the chance to be part of this panel. So once again, thank you very much. I'm just going to talk very briefly about how we use deliberative methods and how it informs the work here at the Bank of England. So our outreach program was devised to create a two-way communication channel between us, ourselves, and the members of the public. So on one hand, it's to build awareness and understanding of our work, but also, and most importantly, I feel, it's to ensure that our policymakers and our senior leaders hear from and understand the lived experiences of people across the UK. So the main way we do this is through our Citizens Forum community. We started this in 2018, very much spearheaded by Andy Haldane, who was our chief economist at the time, and also following the report from the RSA, which Rima was the lead author of. We organize panels and they're set in different English regions and devolved nations across the UK. They're between 90 minutes to 2 hours, excuse me, and they're set on a specific topic. Unsurprisingly, for the last few, they've been around the cost of living. Facilitators capture key themes in small discussion groups, and they are presented at the end of each discussion topic. It's hosted by an individual independent chair who is known for their networks or their connection in that specific area, and a senior leader or policymaker is the one hosting that panel. At the end of the session, we end it. We end the session with a Q&A with the policymaker. So members of the public get to ask questions directly to them. And at the end of each session, summaries are shared of the discussion, both internally across different teams across the bank, but also externally, so to people in attendance. Now, while we can't say that a individual panel can have a direct impact on an interest rate decision, for example, what it can do is give our policymakers a better understanding of the realities on the ground. So since 2018, we've held 66 panels and 11 discussion groups where we delve into a more specific topic and events. So for 2023, we've held 20 events. 13 in person and 7 online. We also have roughly 4,000 members of the Citizen Forum community since 2018. And how people sign up, people can sign up by going to our website. We also promote these citizen panels through social media as well. So I just want to stress and say that by no means is our engagement perfect. It is it is a lot. We do rely on self-selection, and ultimately that means that people who sign up tend to have an interest in what we do, have heard of us, for example, and are curious to hear about what we have to say. We could be better at reaching different groups, and we are looking at ways to do this better. For example, we're looking at how we could work with schools, for example, to deliver these panels, to increase, more younger people to join these panels, as well as reach different groups in society. But also we created something called the Community Forum, which is where we work with the third sector and the people that they support to hear from lesser heard from groups. So I hope that gives a really helpful overview of what we do, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more of the questions and speaking more.
Thank you so much. That was really great, Isabel. Really great to hear about the work that you're doing there. It was a fascinating discussion, and thank you, all of you, for sharing the work that you've been doing. I think while we let the audience think of a few questions, we're just going to get started with a few from us. And the first one for me is, this is a new area of work. There hasn't been much work done on deliberation in economic policymaking. And I just wondered if we could talk about that for a bit. Like, why don't you think we've had as much attention on engaging the public on economic questions to date? And Chris, I wondered if maybe you could take that first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I wouldn't like to say, I think there is a bit of a critical mass now, right? We are moving into that space more and more. Of course, Isabel was, very modestly talked about the potential issues in the way the Bank of England is running deliberation. But of course, having this kind of system within one of the major decision-making centres in the UK economy is a major piece of progress, I think, right? So I think it is important to reflect on the successes that there have been, and there's groups like us, and Suzanne, of course, you've had a cost of living related project in London. Positive Money has done some really great work in Cheshire East on local decision making, which has a strong economic component. So, you know, there is some stuff going on, but I totally take the point. Longer term, you know, this is a relatively new area for deliberation, and I think I would probably reflect on, you know, the history of economic policy change over the last few decades is about depoliticization and about trying to insulate economic policy from politics, for better or worse. And so, you know, the Bank of England's independence in 1998, the ECB, of course, was set up as a highly independent, insulated institution as well. And then in 2010, the Office for Budgetary Responsibility was set up, and we saw a lot more emphasis on fiscal rules. So there was a concerted effort to introduce technocracy as oversight. And I think that technocracy has a really important role in this, and you know, it's important to have that kind of voice in there as well. But we've seen in the last few years these kind of bases for legitimacy being challenged in various ways, and so I think there's now a renewed interest in finding ways to reintroduce some kind of new form of democratic oversight that doesn't just look like representative politics. And so that's kind of where we've come from in that sense. So, you know, depoliticization can mean lots of different things. It doesn't have to mean no democratic oversight. It can just be about the relationship between technical economic oversight and representative politics and the broader idea of citizen voice that projects like ours embody. So I think that's the kind of long-term reasoning. I think in the immediate term, I see a lot of progress and a lot of people who are, if not focusing directly on the economy, then folding economic questions into what they're doing in deliberative projects.
Thank you, and really great to hear about those examples that are going on, you know, very around the country right now. So thank you for that, Nicholas. I wondered if you wanted to share your views on that question, perhaps bring in thoughts from a sort of international perspective as well.
Yeah, certainly prepared to hop in on that subject. I mean, we've gone through a generation, really, you could argue a generation and a half of reform. Chris mentioned this, where the theme is depoliticization, and I, like Chris, have quite a bit of room for that, and have in fact argued that we should do in fiscal policy something like we've done in monetary policy, which is to try to build structures which somehow untangle us from the tyranny of the focus group, the tyranny of the opinion polls, the tyranny of short-term optimizing of the electoral cycle. So it is very important that these things are, that these policies are pursued on the merits, not on the temporary political advantages that they will afford one political participant over another. But we've taken technocracy as a sort of solution. And the problem with technocracy is that technocracy comes with a bunch of downsides. Technocracies are run by elites, and people are pretty unhappy about the way in which they're being treated by elites. Technocracies, as far as we have imagined them, no real reason for this, but technocracies come with careerism, and I think of careerism as an increasingly bad problem. And let me just put an idea into your head, which is one thought I had in talking tonight was to say, imagine if the Bank of England was replaced by a citizen assembly. Now, that's a provocative thing to say, and it's a kind of thought experiment. It's not a proposal. Now, what would happen is that the terrified citizens who happen to be chosen by democratic lottery would immediately say what everyone would say if you proposed this, which is, well, how do they know about monetary policy? They don't. And they would do what politicians do, which is they would rapidly build a technocracy, which is pretty much like what we have, certainly to advise them. So it's not a case of saying a citizen assembly is inferior to the other problem. It would gravitate towards the same problems. But there is a deeper problem, which is that I think our democracy is grappling with the fact. So many of you will be familiar with a fellow called Joseph Schumpeter, who wrote a very powerful book. I recommend it, called Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, in the middle of World War II, 1943. And what he said was that democracy was not ruled by the people. It was a competition between factions of the elite for the consent of the governed. And that is a better empirical description of what electoral democracy is. But one of the important presumptions that he articulates there is that this depends upon an upper middle class elite that has broad allegiance to basic democratic norms. That is an elite that will say, well, we lost that election, we're handing over to our opponents. How's that going then? That is up for grabs. Now, so if you're looking for something to defend basic democratic norms, it turns out that I have a solution. I have a suggestion for you. A citizen assembly can be trusted more than a careerist elite, where people will ring up sound chaps and there is a system of patronage there and so on. And let me give you a quick stat on this. Most of you will know that the Republicans in the United States are at the moment, they're much better at exploiting gerrymandering to stay in power than Democrats are. That certainly wasn't the case in the 1930s in the South, for instance, but it's certainly the case now. Now, if you ask a Republican voter to vote against a Republican because they are entrenching gerrymanders, almost none of them will do it. But if you poll people and say, do you think gerrymandering is a serious problem and are you against it? Do you want to do something about it? 92% of Democrat voters say, yes, we should do something about it. And 88% of Republican voters say the same thing. And the successful states in America that are tackling this, and Michigan stands out, has a citizen commission on redistricting. And that's cleaning up gerrymandering. And you can't get around it by appointing a mate to it because it's the people and they're defending basic democratic norms. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'm going to move on to a second question from us. And Isabel, I'd like to invite you to respond first. I just hearing a little bit, you described the work that you're doing at the Bank of England. I wonder if you've got any sort of learnings or insights from some of the things that you've been doing recently about some of its potential, which you've spoken to, but also perhaps any of its limitations. So, for example, we've had a question from Rebecca in the chat who said it's great to see the work that the bank is doing on participation, but you mentioned that groups are self-selecting. So have you considered recruiting or working with a sort of representative sample? Might give you a bit more of an accurate picture of the breadth of citizens' views, for example. So yeah, any thoughts you have on that would be great.
Oh, that is the golden question. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Carrie. Just in terms of, I guess key insights here is the benefits of deliberative methods for us is, we're getting people's lived experiences and how our policies impact them in real time. As you can imagine, of course, we get lots of data and resources, but I really think citizen panels give us that understanding right then and there, or how they members of the public think it will impact them in the short and medium term. Also, in many ways, I did say it was a bit limited, but deliberation does help us reach harder to reach audiences and get insights in a way that an online survey or other sources of data are not able to do. so yes, to answer that question, that is something that we're thinking about. How do we work with or use more representative methods, or partner with organizations? We'd absolutely love to, but we are definitely limited by budgets and resources. We are a small team in the outreach team. There's about 2 people working, full time on citizen panels. So we do rely on our volunteers as well across the bank. So yeah, it's a mixture of how do you balance between your intention of making sure that you are hearing from more representative group, balance with the realities on the ground, which is everyone's classic, budget and resourcing restraints.
Thanks as well. And Chris, I wonder from your recent work as well, any kind of learning that you kind of pick out, a couple of points perhaps?
I mean, to echo what Isabel says, it's resource intensive stuff. As I said, I'm new to this area, and I probably took on more than I should have done, and I kind of realized how enormous it was to keep this kind of project going. So the resource constraints are real, and they do affect what you can do. So there will inevitably be trade-offs in how you do these things. How do you try and strike the right balance between the breadth of topics you address and having sufficient depth? I think what we did work for us, but I think there are lots of different ways and different choices that you could make, which would also be interesting and valid. So I think just striking that balance between what you can cover reasonably in the amount of time you have was one of the major things that really struck me about it. And as I say, I think we judged it reasonably well, but I think there are lots of other potential answers to how you would run a project like ours.
Thank you. Really interesting, and it kind of segues nicely into some questions from the audience as well, which I'm going to bring in now. And Chris, I was wondering if maybe you could have a think about this first one from Nikki Wilson, who said that speakers have alluded to gaps in awareness and understanding of economic issues, and that's certainly some work that we're looking into at King's at the minute. I'll see if I can post something on that. And she said that there's a key role in deliberation in ensuring that all have the same information in process, and in processes as intensive as deliberation, do the panelists feel that there is enough time for participants to both receive and digest information before being asked to then deliberate on it? And how might this impact accessibility and participation? I wonder, Chris, if perhaps you could reflect on your experience of the Economic Council and how that went when you were giving participants so much information and then asking them to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, we put a lot of effort into making the participants comfortable with what we were doing and comfortable about volunteering their opinions on economic issues. And that was really, that was down to Ipsos's expertise at coaching the participants along. So it was about making them comfortable. And we had several scene setting exercises right at the beginning, to encourage them to see 2 things really: to encourage them to see the economy as something they were a part of. Where did they fit in? How was fiscal policy relevant to them in a day-to-day sense? And secondly, about seeing economics not just as the weather, as something that we do have control over through political levers of power, right? And so overcoming those was really important at the beginning. And then when we gave participants the scenarios, we really tried to defend them from as much of the economics as possible. So, all of that kind of modeling we presented in a very accessible way. And whenever there were points of misunderstanding, or where they wanted to know more, the participants, then we would make ourselves very available to address those things. So we developed an online resource, a Padlet, to answer kind of more factual questions, and made sure that any questions that they had were then addressed either by the team or by speakers in subsequent sessions. So being hyper responsive and alert to the lack of awareness of some economic issues and terminology was important, and just defending them from as much of that as possible, because the basic decisions we're talking about are as much political and ethical as economic. And so keeping that register of discussion kind of made it more accessible as well. But yeah, it was hard work, but I do feel like we got there in the end. And in our post-event survey, pretty much everyone said that they felt that we got the level and complexity of the information right. I think one person said it was they would have preferred it to be more complicated. They found it simplistic, but no one found it to go over their head, and that certainly tallies with the kind of verbal feedback we got in the sessions. So that was probably my biggest concern, but I was happily surprised by how straightforward it was to actually get people on board and get them comfortable with economics as a topic.
Thank you, Chris. That's really helpful, and a good set of evaluation scores as well from your participants. That's really great. Isabel, I was wondering if you could perhaps reflect on that question as well about the issue of presenting participants with economic information, and how you found that when you've been doing the economic, the sort of citizen panels around the country.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. And I completely agree with what Chris said. You know, I cannot stress the importance of creating that encouraging, safe space to share views, and that emphasis on it's not about how much you're aware of economic theories, concepts, even, everyday economic terms, excuse me. It's about their opinions and about, their ability to share their experiences. So in terms of our citizen panels, we, as part of briefing our policymakers or senior leaders, we really encourage them to use more accessible language, to remove acronyms, the use of acronyms, everybody's favorite, or to explain them if they do use them. And we find that, in terms of feedback from the people who attend the the panels, they do find that our colleagues that they are accessible, that they are able to explain how they see the economy in a more relatable way, which is great. And that's something that has been something that we've been improving on over time.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear from both of you that the work that you're doing really evidences the fact that these topics are discussable with publics, in things that you might otherwise think exist in technocracy. And Nicholas, I'm coming to you on this point very shortly. So yeah, really great to hear those examples and to demonstrate the evidence that it is possible. Nicholas, this is a question I'm going to direct to you in the first instance from Elsa, and it's to do with candor. She said she was interested to know where you might see, or when panelists might see, the role of kind of impartial research services, like within parliaments in supporting deliberative processes. And I was struck by you describing kind of citizens' assemblies needing to build a technocracy to advise it. So there's a number of different aspects there. So how that relates to kind of candor, where the role of sort of intermediaries or sort of independent services might work with that. Any kind of reflections on that, and whether that indeed helps to address some of the deficit that you've described.
It's certainly a good question. Where we reinvent what we need to reinvent, and a citizen assembly, as it proceeds, will invent a bureaucracy for itself, or at least it will realize that it needs access to independent expertise, and then it understands that is a problem. And again, that's a particular thing that I'm pretty interested in, because most citizen assemblies, most citizen juries have, well, in fact, I guess all of them have consultants crawling all over them. They are moderated by service providers who are paid on contract and so on, and people build careers out of this, and they build livelihoods out of this, and good luck to them. I think if we really want to prove up this method of governance, we need to start thinking about the problems of how would a people's branch, if you like, how would a body, what I'm proposing is a standing citizen chamber. How would it be self-governing? Because the House of Commons is self-governing. The House of Commons decides what the House of Commons is going to be doing. The House of Lords is the same, and so on. And ultimately, but it can't, an MP doesn't arrive in Westminster knowing how to run the House of Commons. This has evolved over a long period of time. So how would we want to replace the people in a citizen's chamber relatively often. So how do we start giving the chamber agency through time? So that to me is a major issue, because ultimately I know, I mean, the consultants that run these things do certainly, the way they're run at the moment, they try to place the people that they're serving in a position of control. But, you know, you wait till these institutions acquire a bit of power. Then people will be very keen to start messing with those kinds of things. So those are things that I think we need to, if we're really serious about growing this type of democracy, we have to realize that we have to ask ourselves the question: do we want it forever to be in a position of supplicant to the existing institutions, or do we want it coming into its own as an institution that can stand on its own 2 feet and start asserting the considered opinion of the people?
Thank you. I wonder, Chris or Isabel, whether you've also got a view on where kind of independent sort of research or other kind of service provision fits within the projects that you're working on or might working on in the future, in terms of that speaking to sort of independence, candor, transparency.
Shall I jump in? Yeah, I think just reflecting what Nicholas said, I mean, that's some really far-sighted commentary, I think. And of course, you cannot resolve power. You know, you can't get rid of power. And so any democratic system is always juggling these kinds of issues. I suppose if I think about the ideal relationship, it would be a balance between democratic voice in these ways and technocratic oversight. So
I think, yeah.
One of the biggest themes that we talked about was long-term investment, and I think there's, you know, Jim O'Neill, the peer, has talked about this, a kind of enhanced role for an organisation like the OBR, the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, in overseeing the whether long-run public investment is a good investment, whether it's likely to produce a return in the long run. And I think that's a really good idea, to have, you know, an independent organisation crunching the sums to figure out our best guess of whether something constitutes a good investment. But then there's a question about how you set priorities for investment and what you actually do and what is valuable to the citizenry. And I can certainly imagine a Citizens Economic Council or some similar body having that kind of input. So they're not deciding on the sums and the economic forecasts that would underpin investment decisions, but they are deciding which kind of programs would be most appropriate to pursue and prioritize. So yeah, I wouldn't like to say exactly what the balance is, but it's definitely about balancing those two aspects. Of course, with the representative electoral systems that we have as well. So yeah, that's all kind of where I sit at the moment. But I think Nicholas's ideas, you know, they're kind of looking far ahead. They're at a bridge we haven't quite crossed yet, in my view.
Nicholas, you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, I wanted to share some Australian experience, which is that, I mean, you know, this idea of having an expert body advise is not a new one, and we've had it in Australia, and it's simply ignored. And we have a situation that's particularly bad in Victoria, where I live. I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, and I think at the last 3 times that government has changed hands by party, the government that has come in has written out a check to private sector builders of infrastructure for over $1 billion, because they say, we don't like their infrastructure plan, we've got our own infrastructure plan. that motorway that we were building, that tollway that we were building, we're not going to be building it anymore. And it's just an extraordinary an extraordinary state of affairs. And we even have a promise from the current Labor government to build something that looks a bit like the Circle Line, but it's you'll be familiar with the Circle Line in London. But its circle is drawn around, mid suburbs, not the outer suburbs. This thing is expected to cost over $100 billion. It was never recommended by the Independent Infrastructure Victoria. I don't think it'll go ahead, but it looked good. It's a nice drawing, and you can you can go to an election on that. Now, so just to throw it out there as a thought experiment, the sort of thought experiment I'm now getting, I now instinctively play when I hear these problems. I think of the Michigan Redistricting Commission, and if you have infrastructure, you do want expert input, no question about that, and then you could have some kind of citizen body, and that may well tame the parties against announcing crazily wasteful infrastructure and tearing each other's massive sunk investments up.
Thank you. That was great. And if you are going to build a Circle Line, please make sure it's a little bit more reliable than ours is. So I'm going to just go to a final question, I think, from the panel before we start to bring things from a close. There's one from Guatam, and we've talked already about the challenge of engaging people in the room with economic issues. Guatam's question really is about how you get them there in the first place. I think particularly when you're talking about something which is perceived to be so complex and I guess outside of the realm of what people do every day. And they ask, how do we sustain engagement from the Citizens Council? How is it a challenge to engage regular citizens who are in various jobs and they have varying levels of understanding and interest on the issue? So I wonder if you could just perhaps reflect on how we get people involved in this, how we make people feel it's part of their everyday duty, I guess. Isabel, I wondered maybe if you wanted to reflect on the challenges. I know you've sort of talked about the issues of self-selection, things like that, but just about how interested people are in coming to these things in the first place.
No, thank you so much, Suzanne. I think, for our citizen panels, what brings people is the ability to share their experiences. So we're not asking them to solve a particular problem. We're just asking for their views. So I think that's how we get people in the room. It's people wanting to share their experiences and how our decisions, our policies are making an impact on their life. Now, in terms of how do we get people engaged for a longer period of time, within the citizen forum community, we do try to have different touch points. So we do, like I said, discussion groups. So people who are interested in sharing their views on a particular topic, that's something that they're welcome to participate in. But we also do, we keep them updated about the work of the bank as well, which I would assume is somewhat interesting for some people. It is for me, obviously. So yeah, I think this is something that we are still grappling with. It's one of the questions that we constantly think about is how do we make sure that it is still relevant to people? How do we bring the work that we do to life, and how do we make sure that people can relate to it better? It's something that we definitely grapple with every day.
Thank you. And Chris, I wondered if you had any reflections on that. I wonder if you sort of had the classic kind of evaluation comment, which when participants say, oh, it was much more interesting than I thought it was going to be, but the challenge of sort of getting them in the room in the first place.
Yes. I mean, those that started the process became increasingly engaged and committed, and we had exactly that by the end. They were just really happy with everything and felt galvanized to know and understand more. And a lot of why weren't we told this before? You know, why isn't this common knowledge? Why isn't everyone talking about this, about various issues? So yes, we did have a lot of that. I mean, we took you know, the classic approach to engaging citizens, which was to pay them, and that gets people who aren't so engaged in the room. And you know, we're doing a different thing to what the Bank of England are doing, in the sense that we wanted to build it on a sortition basis, to have this kind of deliberative democratic basis to what we were doing. So we took that classic route, but of course that means, you know, budgets go up and up and up if you're remunerating participants. So that was important. But again, I just say it wasn't difficult to get the participants engaged once they were in the room. I mean, one other thing to say is that we had a relatively high number of dropouts from initial commitment to who was in the room. So we were hoping for 50, and you always expect some dropouts, but I think 11 was perhaps a little higher than you would normally expect. It's difficult to contact these people and find out why that was. They didn't have any particular characteristics. They were spread across the demographic characteristics of the group. But yeah, those who were there, no matter what their initial experience or their personal situation, it wasn't very difficult to get them on board with it being important and interesting.
Thank you. So as ever, we're running out of time. We always do. So many good questions and so much good stuff to talk about. But we didn't want to leave without asking you all one final question. So, and given the time, if you could just give us one bullet point, which I know is a little bit mean. But the question is, what do you think is or should be next for public engagement in economics? So, and to pick up on a few of the things that have come up in the chat, you know, for example, a new government next year in the UK gives us a unique opportunity to change culture, restore trust in democracy, and think about how economic policy might fit in there. Could, for example, the Bank of England create a budget using participatory budgeting methods with citizens rather than it be the Chancellor? You know, where do you think we should be going next with public engagement in economics? Nicholas, I'm going to come to you first.
Well, okay, you may, I don't know whether you think of this as economic policy. It is economic policy. You have, I don't know what it's called in your system, but under the NHS, you have the NHS and its advisors decide on what extremely expensive cancer drugs get funded on some kind of cost-benefit basis. But David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, as occurred many years before in our system, has a special slush fund where he can just write out if particular people who manage to get lots of attention or happen to be particularly influential, if they need a couple of, you know, if they need £100,000 for cancer treatment, even if the experts say it's not worth it, then that gets funded out of this special slush fund. So that's what I like about this is that you could hive that off and say, here, you decide. These are impossible decisions to make, and if you give it to everyday people to think about, deliberate on, and to bear the costs of their decisions, then you have a nice. Then you've landed something with a lot of attractive features, and you've closed what I call the accountability gap. So that's, and there are lots of other ways to do that, but that's an example of the sort of thing that could be done.
Perfect. Thanks, Nicholas. Isabel, how about you? What do you think should be next?
It's nothing groundbreaking, but I do think that, you know, the benefits of deliberation should go both ways. So we've talked a lot about how, you know, members of the public can have a really offer a really interesting perspective on policy making. But I also think this is, you know, an opportunity to help experts in the field make economics more accessible and easier to understand, and, you know, to dispel myths and demystify the topic.
Perfect, Isabel, thank you. And Chris, finally from you.
I mean, like I said, I feel like there's a bit of a critical mass of interest and people working on these projects. So for me, it's about coalition building amongst those of us who are interested in doing this, comparing our experiences in exactly the way that we're doing here, to make sure that we've got good working models for this kind of process available. And then when that opportunity is there to impact decision makers, politicians, and so on, that we've got the ideas there to run with. And then it's partly also about convincing decision makers that it's in their interest to use these kinds of models as well. So I see it as about coalition building and trying to drive impact in the policy space. That's where next for me.
Brilliant. That's really interesting. Thanks. Some really great questions there. Thank you. So I think with all that, it only remains for us to say thank you for joining us this morning. And thank you for joining Nicholas, Christopher and Isabel. You are all brilliant speakers, and we really appreciate you sharing your expertise and your experience very generously.
Very quick question, Suzanne. Is it possible to circulate the Q&A that circulated during the meeting, so that if people want us to answer questions, we can do so, because they'll all disappear otherwise?
We've got them. Yeah, we can do that, no problem.
Okay, thank you.
No, and obviously it's, we haven't been able to get through all the questions in the time, so completely happy to do that. It's just left for us, I think, to wish you all a very happy winter season. We'll see you in the new year.
Summer season.
Summer season, sorry. Of course. It's winter.
Can't you tell? I mean, short sleeves.
That's true.
I thought I'd try and introduce some variety for you.
Is that short sleeves? Definitely a direct contrast. Yes. But we'll see you all in the new year, when we'll be planning events for International Women's Day, amongst other things. So as ever, keep a lookout for news and dates, and a reminder that all of our previous seminars are available on YouTube. So if you want a refresh, or perhaps a break from whatever Christmas films are on the BBC. So until then, thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.